In September 2013, Typhoon Usagi made landfall on the coast of Guangdong province in southern China, carrying maximum sustained winds of 165 kilometers per hour. 25 people died. At 10 minutes to 4 on Sunday morning, the 26th of July, 2026, Typhoon Noul made landfall near the town of Pinghai, on the coast of Guangdong province, about 80 kilometers northeast of Hong Kong, carrying maximum sustained winds of 162 kilometers per hour. Same province, same coastline, same category of storm, within 3 kilometers an hour of each other, 13 years apart. The confirmed death toll in Guangdong from Sunday's storm is, as of this recording, effectively 0. That does not make sense, not on the face of it. Typhoons do not become gentler because time passes. The Pearl River Delta has not moved, the South China Sea has not cooled, and there are more people living in the path than there were in 2013, not fewer. So something changed, and it is not the weather. In the next 25 minutes, I'll show you exactly what that something is, using China's own historical record. I'll walk through 4 typhoons that hit this same province over the past 2 decades, and what each of them cost. I'll show you the one number that explains the entire gap. I'll explain why people used to die in these storms, and what specifically stopped it. And then, I'll tell you what has not been solved, because there is a serious answer to that, and it involves a completely different kind of water. Let's start with the ledger, because the history here is stark and almost nobody puts it in one place. September 2003. Typhoon Dujuan struck Guangdong after passing Hong Kong. 38 people died, and around 1,000 were injured. 20 of the deaths were in Shenzhen, 9 in Huizhou. It was described at the time as the most damaging storm to hit the Pearl River Delta since 1979. It cut power and water in Shanwei and in parts of Shenzhen. Hold on to one detail from Dujuan, because we will come back to it. Many of those deaths happened when poorly built structures collapsed, specifically shacks used to house migrant workers. 16 migrant workers on a single construction site were among the dead. September 2010. Typhoon Fanapi, the strongest storm to hit China that year, made landfall in Fujian, but did its worst damage in neighboring Guangdong. The death toll climbed over several days, 33, then 55, then 70, with dozens more listed as missing at various points. Around 99,500 people had been evacuated. Some 3,765 houses collapsed. Over 42,000 hectares of farmland were damaged. Economic losses ran to 2.4 billion yuan. Parts of Guangdong recorded 64 centimeters of rain in 24 hours, the province's worst rains in a century. 5 people died when a dam burst. 25 disappeared in a rain-triggered mudslide. Helicopters had to airdrop relief supplies into cut-off counties. September 2013. Typhoon Usagi, described by meteorologists at the time as the most powerful storm on Earth that year, hit Guangdong at 165 kilometers per hour. 25 dead. August 2017. Typhoon Hato. At least 8 deaths in Guangdong, 4 in Zhuhai, 3 in Zhongshan, 1 in Zhongmen, and 8 more across the border in Macau. Around 27,000 people were evacuated to temporary shelters. Nearly 2 million households lost power, at least briefly. In Zhuhai alone, roughly 275 homes collapsed, with damage estimated at 5.5 billion yuan. 38, 70, 25, 16, and then, on Sunday, a storm of the same strength as Usagi hit the same province and, as far as the reporting currently shows, killed nobody there. Here is the number that explains it. According to Xinhua, more than 801,000 people had been relocated for safety in Guangdong by Sunday. Now put that against the historical column. Hato, 2017, around 27,000 evacuated. 8 dead in Guangdong. Fanapi, 2010, around 99,500 evacuated. A toll that climbed past 50. Noul, 2026. More than 801,000 relocated. effectively zero. That is roughly 30 times the Hato evacuation and 8 times the Fanapi evacuation, for a storm of comparable strength on the same coast. The death toll does not make sense as a function of the weather. It makes complete sense as a function of how many people were not standing in front of it. So let me describe what an 801,000 person relocation actually involves, because the number gets read as a statistic and it is really a description of a machine. It starts with mapping. Somebody has to know, before the storm arrives, which specific villages, fishing communities, low-lying urban districts, coastal aquaculture operations, and construction sites fall inside the projected impact zone. That is a rolling assessment updated as the forecast track tightens. Then it requires somewhere for those people to go. In practice, that means schools, gymnasiums, community halls, and government buildings designated in advance as shelters and stocked before the season, rather than during the emergency. Then it requires transport, and critically, the transport has to finish before conditions deteriorate. You cannot evacuate people during a typhoon. Roads flood, visibility collapses, and moving buses full of people into rising wind is more dangerous than sheltering in place. The entire operation has to complete hours ahead of landfall, and it requires the authority to make people go. Evacuation orders in China are not advisory in the way they often are elsewhere. Whatever you think of that as a general principle, on a weekend in July on the Guangdong coast, it is a large part of why the numbers look the way they do. Alongside the relocation, the province shut itself down. High-speed rail across Guangdong was canceled. Flights were canceled in large numbers, with figures reported between several hundred at Hong Kong International alone, and around 1,800 grounded across the wider affected region. Fishing fleets were called into harbor, and drone footage released by Xinhua showed boats packed into port in rows on Saturday, waiting it out. Underneath all of that sits the warning system, and it functioned exactly as designed. China uses a 4-tier color-coded weather alert system. Blue is the lowest, then yellow, then orange, then red. On Saturday evening, the National Meteorological Center issued a red typhoon warning, the first red typhoon alert issued anywhere in the country in 2026. Then, as Noul weakened after landfall, the alert was stepped down to orange, and later on Sunday to yellow. That sequence matters more than it sounds. A warning system that only ever escalates trains people to ignore it. A system that visibly comes back down when the threat recedes is one people learn to trust. And trust is the thing that determines whether an evacuation order gets obeyed. Now the deeper question. Why did people die in the old storms? Go back to Dujuan in 2003. The deaths were concentrated in collapsing structures, and specifically in shacks housing migrant workers, with 16 killed on one construction site. Go to Fanapi in 2010. Nearly 4,000 houses collapsed. A dam burst. A mudslide took 25 people. Go to Hato in 2017. 275 homes collapsed in Zhuhai alone. Notice what those have in common. Overwhelmingly, people were not killed by wind directly. They were killed by buildings, by structures that could not take the load, in an era when a great deal of the Pearl River Delta's explosive growth was housed in temporary and informal construction thrown up alongside the factories. Two things changed after that. The first is the buildings themselves. 2 decades of construction standards, enforcement, and simple replacement of informal housing with permanent structures removed an enormous share of the risk. A typhoon that flattens a shack does not flatten a reinforced concrete apartment block, and the Delta today has far more of the latter and far less of the former than it did in 2003. The second is the evacuation of the people who are still exposed. Construction sites, fishing communities, aquaculture workers, and residents of older low-lying housing are exactly the categories being moved in that 801,000 figure. The system now identifies the same populations that used to appear in the casualty lists and takes them out of the path first. There is a third factor, and I want to be honest about it, because it is the part that flatters nobody. Noul weakened fast. It came ashore at 162 kilometers per hour and dropped to tropical storm strength within hours as it moved inland. A storm that maintained intensity longer, or that arrived on a higher tide, or that stalled over the delta and dumped rain for a day, would have produced a different set of numbers regardless of how many people were moved. Preparation reduced the exposure enormously. It did not make the outcome inevitable. Some of Sunday was luck, and pretending otherwise would be the same error in the opposite direction. Which brings me to what has not been solved, and it is the most important part of this report. While Guangdong was being evacuated, the Ministry of Water Resources and the China Meteorological Administration jointly issued a red warning for flash floods, covering parts of Jiangxi, Hunan, Guangdong, Sichuan, Shaanxi, Gansu, and southeastern Xinjiang for the period from Sunday evening through Monday evening. That is a warning for a completely different hazard, across a swathe of the country far from the coast, because a typhoon does not end at landfall. Noul moved inland after Guangdong, carrying rain into Jiangxi, Hunan, and Hubei, with precipitation forecast to persist into Tuesday and to reach provinces as far north as Henan and Shandong. And here is the uncomfortable fact from the same weekend. At around 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, in the Shuangshimen Scenic Area in Weiwan County, Gansu Province, inland, northwest, and outside anything the typhoon itself touched, a mountain torrent triggered by short-duration heavy rainfall swept through a valley full of campers. 10 people were killed and 23 injured. 174 were rescued by 305 firefighters and rescue personnel. That event was not caused by Noul. But notice the timing against that joint red flash flood warning, which covered Gansu among 6 other provinces and opened its window on Sunday evening. The torrent arrived in the early afternoon. That is the shape of the remaining problem. The Chinese system has become extraordinarily good at the hazard you can see coming for 3 days across open ocean. It has not solved, and arguably nobody has solved, the hazard that develops in one mountain catchment in under an hour and reaches people in 10 minutes. I should also correct something, because you have probably seen it. A number of outlets ran headlines this week reporting that Typhoon Noul killed 10 people in China. Those 10 are the Gansu victims. They died roughly 1,500 kilometers from the typhoon's track in a separate weather event. The Associated Press and others reported the two separately and clearly. The merge happened downstream, because both stories carried the words China, rain, flooding, and deaths on the same day. It is a compression error, not a conspiracy, and it is worth knowing because it makes the actual story invisible. The typhoon did kill people, incidentally, but not in China. Before reaching Guangdong, Noul clipped the extreme northern islands of the Philippines. The Philippine government's disaster agency reported 3 dead and 1 missing, with more than 9. 300 people evacuated, and 235 houses damaged. That contrast deserves stating plainly. The same storm, at lower intensity, over a country with far fewer resources and a far harder geography of scattered islands, killed 3 people. At higher intensity over Guangdong, it killed none. That is not a comment on anyone's competence. It is a comment on what money and infrastructure buy in a disaster, and it is the single clearest illustration of it you will find this year. So let me be direct about what this does and does not mean. It does not mean Guangdong was devastated. The reported physical damage was uprooted trees in Huilai County, a partially collapsed scaffolding structure in Hong Kong, flooding, and canceled transport. Hong Kong reported at least 9 people injured. It does not mean anyone was trapped. 800,000 people were relocated by the authorities. That is the opposite of trapped, and it is good news that keeps being reported as though it were bad. It does not mean the province is undamaged in a broader sense. The National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan, about 14.8 million US dollars, for post-disaster recovery, earmarked for restoring roads, water conservancy facilities, schools and hospitals. That is a meaningful sum for repair. It is also, notably, nowhere near what a flattened province would require. And the national relief response was set at level 4, the lowest of 4 tiers. And it does not mean the risk is retreating. Noul was the 12th named storm to affect China this year, and the 3rd landfall in roughly a month, following Bavi and Maysak. Noul was slightly stronger than Bavi, which hit eastern and northeastern China about 2 weeks earlier. That compression is the thing to watch. Response capacity is finite. The same crews, shelters, stockpiles, and drainage systems handle each event in turn. Storms spaced across a season allow recovery between them. Storms arriving in close succession land on saturated ground, unrepaired infrastructure, and rested too little personnel. And the Western Pacific typhoon season historically peaks in August and September, not July. Here is what I'll be watching. The first is the inland toll. Typhoon deaths in China have historically come from rain rather than wind, and they surface days later in inland provinces the storm reached after landfall. Watch Jiangxi, Hunan, and Hubei over the coming week, and watch for landslide reporting specifically. The second is whether the level 4 response is escalated. That is the clearest available signal that a damage assessment came back worse than the first read. The third is the recovery allocation. The 100 million yuan is a first tranche. Whether it is supplemented, and by how much, follows damage more honestly than any press statement. The fourth is the Philippines. 3 dead and 1 missing was the figure on Sunday. Tolls there routinely rise as reports come in from remote island municipalities, and that country storm losses consistently receive a fraction of the international coverage China's due. The fifth is what forms next in the warm pool east of the Philippines. 3 landfalls in a month, entering the strongest months of the season, is the actual story here, not any single storm. I want to end where I started, with the arithmetic that opened this. In 2013, a typhoon carrying 165 km/h winds hit Guangdong and killed 25 people. On Sunday, a typhoon carrying 162 km/h winds hit Guangdong and killed nobody there. The difference is not that the storm was weaker. The difference is that on Friday and Saturday, somebody drew a line around the parts of a province that were going to get hit, and then 800,000 people were moved out from behind it. Buses ran. Shelters opened. Boats came into harbor. Trains stopped. Somebody went out to the fishing villages and the construction sites, the same places that filled the casualty lists in 2003 and 2010, and told the people there to leave. And they left. There is no footage of that. No drone shot, no dramatic rescue, nothing that trends. It is the most boring possible form of disaster response, and on Sunday morning, it was worth roughly 25 lives compared to the last time this happened. 10 hours later, in a valley in Gansu with no warning available and no time to give one, 10 people died. That is the whole picture. One hazard we have learned to handle, one we have not. We'll be watching the inland figures.